say that I have the key, but hopefully, I think you might think by the time I finished, a key. Right. The first question is, are we interested in our own biography, our own personal biography? How many of us keep a diary? Or if we do, when did we stop? Are we really interested in our own lives, what goes on in our own lives? And if we're not interested in our own biography, isn't it difficult for us to be interested in national biography or global biography? The sense of your own story is key. What is our personal story, our national story, our global story? And who is trying to tell us what our story is? For example, some of those people, famous George Orwell's 1984, those who control the past control the future. Those who control the present control the past, quote from that book. So those elite institutions which determine, which tell us through our school system and the rest of it, through the media, documentaries and so on, what our past was and how we should understand it. They're actually setting the parameters for a long-term understanding of where we're headed in the future. For example, whether Gordon Brown thinks that our destiny as a nation is to outcompete China and India, for example, whether that's what we're really all here, all of us as individuals, to be giving our lives for. J.R. Seeley was a leading Victorian imperialist historian, published The Expansion of England, a tremendous bestseller in its time, went on to be reprinting until the 1950s. We study history that we may be wise before the event, not after it. Students of political science, history, ought to be able to foresee, at least in outline, the event while it's still future. Now, Seeley was highly connected to all the English elite circles of the time, various prime ministers, particularly Lord Rosebery in the 1890s. So here you have a historian who's not just interested in describing the past, but actually in forecasting and predicting, giving a vision of the future. Here's another picture, more modern, 1987, a book by a guy called J.T. Fraser, Time, the Familiar Stranger. It's a little bit militaristic in its imagery, but nevertheless I think there's some truth in it. The people of Earth are at war to decide whose interpretation of the past is going to shape the future of mankind. The ethos that will eventually conquer the minds of people will be the one that succeeds in creating a framework of historical understanding for which a believable and inspiring future for mankind may be constructed. If you change the words at war and conquer, put something a little bit more friendly, the question is, what is the vision of the story that is being given to us, and how far can we be in control of that story ourselves? These are some of the guys who you're all familiar with, who are seeking to tell us what our story should be. Kissinger, Rockefeller, Philip Bobbitt, who wrote the famous book, The Shield of Achilles, who believes that we're moving from the nation state into the market state era. So nations and folk communities are now irrelevant because there's only the point individual and the periphery global organism. Francis Fukuyama, David mentioned the Project for the New American Century. He was one of the signers, and of course famous for the End of History thesis, another visionary history, but closely connected with all these gentlemen. And finally, Zbigniew Brzezinski, a creature, a political creature, in fact, of Rockefeller. And now, of course, as you probably know, Barack Obama's senior eminence grise behind the scenes in foreign policy. Some other visions of the future which we're being given at the moment. Ray Kurzweil, cyberneticist, who would be only too happy for biological humanity to suddenly disappear as fast as possible so we could all download our consciousnesses into robots. So we give up being biological organisms and become mineral organisms. So he's in his book, The Age of Spiritual Machines, he is forecasting almost year by year, he gives a breakdown of the steps by which this process will take place. So by the end of this century, the 21st century, he fully expects that biological humanity will be terminated, will have come to an end, we'll have moved to the next level of evolution in which our consciousnesses will be essentially fused with robotic beings. And then this gentleman you probably also know, the nonagenarian Jacques Fresco, if you've seen the Zeitgeist movie. There he's the technological solution offered in the Zeitgeist movie, which from my perspective is what I would say is basically a neo-Marxist production. And he, again, basically, a bit like Ray Kurzweil, but not quite so radical, is seeing the future solution to our problems in terms of technological solutions, engineering solutions by engineers, because he's an engineer and a designer. But I think we've seen enough of technological development since the Industrial Revolution to know that the most profound human problems will not, in fact, be solved only by technology. But according to Jacques Fresco, business, forget it. Economics, politics, forget it. Economics, religion, forget it. These things. The solution is technology. That's one vision of the future being put out to us. Here's another one, very different. Now you might wonder, why are these two guys appearing on the same slide? James Lovelock, the proponent of the Gaia thesis, and the lizard man. This is a gentleman who is actually seriously seeking to turn himself into an animal. He's put implants in his forehead, he has shaved his teeth and he's forked his tongue, and he's covered in animal tattoos. So what is the connection here? These two guys, in a certain sense, one more theoretical, one more practical in his actual body, they're seeking to merge in a certain way with the biological animal realm from which, in a sense, we ourselves were connected with long ago. So you have a very powerful polarity here. Please forgive me, because I'm going to have to make this a bit short in terms of the sketching of this polarity, between a robotic future and an animalistic future, a future in which we merge with the mineral world, or a future in which we merge with the biological world, or rather the animal world. And this polarity is very, very ancient and very, very deep-rooted. And we can trace it back, right back to the Bible story of Cain and Abel. And if you really ask yourself, what is the meaning of that story? I'm not going to go into it in depth now, but just to flag this up. What is the meaning of Cain and Abel, the one who spends his time only with the animals and grows nothing, but just simply takes care of the animals, husbands them, herds them, and the Cain who creates new products and is a farmer, works with his hands in doing things in the world. This polarity, this archetype, is as old, if not older, in a certain sense, even though they're both men. The archetype is deeper in a certain sense, I would maintain, than the male-female archetype. But that's another aspect of it, which we're continually invited, particularly in the Western world, to be interested in, this battle of the sexes, this twofoldness. Now, perhaps I should just say a little bit, very, very briefly, a couple of minutes, because you don't know me from Adam. I'm probably one of the most least-known speakers here. Just a couple of little biographical details, because I think it's very important. Also in the alternative community, many people have mentioned how we need to understand the elite people, agents who mediate information to us, and we certainly do. But we also got to apply that to ourselves, as anybody who's researching. So, I'm obligated to at least explain something to you about myself, and for you to ask any questions at any point. So, where I'm coming from, I need to be upfront about that. I was born in Newport, which is near the old Roman base of Caerleon, Isca. The Second Roman Legion used to be based there. The Romans had 3 legions in Britannia: York, Chester, and Caerleon, Isca. I was brought up in Chester. The name means camp. Next Roman base, 22nd Legion. So 2nd Legion and 22nd Legion. You'll perhaps come to see that has some meaning later on. I grew up in Chester, which is a very beautiful tourist trap, and it's very hard, perhaps if you're sensitive to that, to the architecture and the history of Chester, not to be interested in history, because it goes back to 79 AD, this city. But I grew up there, and then I went on to Manchester to become a man, but also a camp, and that's where I studied history at Manchester University. And then I went on to Tokyo in Japan, where I taught English. So I went from one island at one end of the, or from your point of view here, one island at the one end of the Eurasian continent, the island at the other end. And these two islands, there's a tremendous cultural span between them. Certain similarities, gardening, for example. One could mention others. But there's a tremendous dissonance in the culture between these two island cultures. And it's not easy for foreigners to live there, despite the superficial similarities to Western culture, high tech, and all the rest of it. And I learned a lot in Japan. It taught me a great deal, and also introduced me to my wife, who I'm happy is with me today at this conference. But questions came up in me in living in this dissonance. And those questions I tried to put to various representatives of Japanese spiritual streams, because by this time I was interested in various spiritual questions in my 20s. And by the time I left Japan, these questions had crystallized, because I was trying to understand what is it? What is the historical difference between these cultures? And these questions had crystallized to three questions, basically, which I sensed said something about the difference between Japan and the West, or Japan and Europe, Japan and England. The one was, what is natural science? Because I realized, despite my education, I didn't really understand it in its essence. The second was, what is Christianity? Like many of my generation, I'd rejected it at the age of 18. I didn't have a religious upbringing. None of my family were not interested in that. But I also realized I didn't understand the spiritual tradition of my own culture. And the third was, why doesn't natural science investigate what happens after death and before birth? Why doesn't natural science investigate reincarnation, for example, which is a given in a culture like Japan? Why is it that reincarnation, in a sense, this knowledge is not there in the West for a long, long time? I'll speak a little bit about that later. But these were the three questions I brought back to the West after 7 years. And I lived in London. Just mentioned that Tokyo has 23 wards. But I lived in London, and in London, very soon, I came across the ideas of this gentleman, which certainly helped me to get some understanding, or pointed me in certain directions from which I could begin to answer these questions I'd set myself. This is the Austrian philosopher and spiritual scientist Rudolf Steiner. And some of you may know a bit of his work through familiarity with things like Waldorf education or biodynamic farming. But you might not know that Rudolf Steiner said some of the most penetrating things about the history of the deep forces underlying the events of the First World War, the 20th century, the last 500 years. On the other hand, I don't want to give the impression that Steiner was only some kind of conspiracist. So just very briefly, these were some of the things he was interested in. One can see that his work spans three areas from the 1880s, thinking and feeling and willing, very broadly. He started out trained as a natural scientist and as a philosopher, and then moved on to spiritual science, esotericism, and Christology. Then he had an artistic development in his work, while the first period continued onwards. And that was, he developed new art forms, eurythmy, movement art, speech formation, artistic speech, singing, Boardman gymnastics, reincarnation dramas, mystery dramas, architecture, new impulses from musical instruments. And then finally, in the chaos of the post-First World War period, he developed new ideas in social threefolding. And I'll speak about that again later, because it's part of the solution, I think, to our problems. Companies were set up on these principles. Waldorf education emerged at this time, biodynamic agriculture, medicines and therapies, cosmetics, ethical banking, special needs education. Now, we all know that great individuals have emerged in various cultures over the centuries. If one thinks of, say, Confucius or Aristotle. Many of these people were not particularly famous in their own cultures, say, after 80 or 100 years after they died. But within their respective cultures in 1,000 or 1,500 years, then there was hardly an educated person in those cultures who did not know them. And I have the suspicion it'll be like this with Steiner. So his work is gradually getting known. But what interested me about him in this particular context of our conference, these are some of the buildings he produced. the Goetheanum in the first Goetheanum in Switzerland, the double-dome building, one of the few in the world. It was destroyed by arson after it had been built, by an arsonist who was influenced by the local Catholic priest. There's a couple of other pictures of it from the air. And then as soon as that was destroyed, Steiner set about building the second one in concrete this time. The first one was in wood. Ooh. So this was in concrete. He actually wanted to build the first one in concrete, but those around him said, no, wood is much more beautiful. So, okay, we built it in wood. And so it was burnt down by an arsonist. Second one, concrete, still stands. But what interested me, as I say, in the context of our conference, is Steiner's interests in the explanation of the First World War, which has always been a great interest of mine. Not so much the Second World War, although I was born only 7 years after the end of the Second World War, and the Second World War was everywhere in my childhood, in the 50s and 60s. But no, the First World War, because of certain family connections, and because of certain things that happened in my biography around the age of 12, when, for example, the BBC did a 50-year-old retrospective of the First World War. Some of the older members here might remember that. And for those of us who've never seen this before, tremendous vista, over some 24 episodes, I think, of footage of the events of the First World War, never before seen. It was like a whole new world opening up at that time. And I was already very much into the big picture in history, as always been interested in history as a child. And so I really wanted to understand what are the causes of this war, which is really the crucible of the 20th century, as far as I could see, even then. And a couple of things I came across before I encountered Steiner's ideas about this, where I'd like to just recommend to you, because in understanding the history of the 20th century, Second World War, First World War, most Anglo-American, English-speaking historiography focuses, of course, on Germany. Immediate pointer to Germany. You go to any public library, most of the very few books which attempt to explain the cause of the First World War will have, for example, pictures of the Kaiser on the front, or pictures of a kettle helmet on the front, Stahlhelm, and so on. The focus is always on Germany. My son did his GCSE, and when was it, 2005, and they were encouraged in their textbook to put Germany in the dock as a nation, like a trial, and to say, well, was Germany guilty? That was the explanation of the cause of the First World War. So this partiality continues on. I was never satisfied with that. And then I was so interested then to find this book on the right, The Diplomacy of the Vatican. After the communists took over in Russia, the Bolsheviks opened up the Tsarist archives, and some very interesting material came out of those archives, which showed how the Vatican was involved in bringing together France and Russia with the aim of bringing about the First World War. This was already in the 1880s, 1887. And what you then find is that who put the Vatican up to that? That was the British. And this is all documented in the Tsarist archives by the Tsarist ambassadors who had meetings with leading members of the British elite in the 1880s. And then the British, through their various connections, such as the Catholic Duke of Norfolk and so on, sought to get the Vatican to bring together these traditional opponents, Tsarist Russia and Republican, atheist, Freemasonic France, with the goal of, between them, crushing the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians in the middle. Completely different picture from that which is normally presented out of historical documented sources from Russia. Modern Western, Anglo-Saxon, English-speaking historiography still does not look in a direction like the Vatican. It just wouldn't occur to them, because their fixation is continually on the German-speaking world. The other thing I came across was this book. I don't know whether you can you see that title at the back? The Transcendental Universe by C.G. Harrison. 6 lectures on occult science, theosophy, and the Catholic faith. This is a fascinating book, published 1993, 100 years after Harrison gave these lectures in 1893 in London to an obscure Christian group. And they are profound. I strongly recommend you to get hold of a copy of this book, because you see in it how somebody who stands, he identifies himself with the high church stream, but he's totally familiar with all of the esotericism and occultism and secret society shenanigans of the 19th century. Totally familiar. He understands the whole score from somebody working within the Anglo-Saxon realm. And he's educating his audience in this. And he points out various principles of history. And one of those is that how the principle of the number 7 works in history. And he gives us an example of that, how just as the Germanic tribes were, as it were, educated and wet-nursed by first the Roman Empire and then the papacy, so the English-speaking world, the rulers, the influencers, the powerful people in the English-speaking world see it as their mission to educate and wet-nurse the Slavic peoples. Because the Slavic peoples, the Slavic-speaking peoples, will be the peoples in the next era of history who will play a leading role. And this is 1893, and he said that in the context of that, the Russian state will be and must be destroyed. The Russian state as it existed in 1893. So you already see a certain kind of knowledge, a vision of the future, which the people with occult knowledge in the English-speaking world in the 1890s already had. And the book on the right shows you how certain these machinations are already being set in place to bring this about from the political side of things. Another thing I found very useful, this was in the days before the internet, late 80s and early 90s. Came across this book in my public library. Never underestimate public libraries, of course, even now. A wonderful, excellent historical study by a professor at the University of Ulster, A.J.A. Morris, The Scaremongers, the Advocacy of War and Rearmament, which shows you with tremendous detail and insight how the British public were prepared and manipulated for war in the years 1896 until 1914. And we will today, of course, recognize many, many of these techniques from the things that have happened in the last 10 years particularly. But this was already going on with the mass media, novels, penny dreadfuls, all the rest of it in those years. So with all of this material in the background, I then came across Steiner's lectures, 25 lectures he gave at the crucial point in the war, Karma of Untruthfulness, it's called, Secret Societies, the Media and Preparations for the Great War, 2 volumes. In the second edition, I was invited to write the introduction to this. But this is still available via Amazon.com. But their lectures are all by Rudolf Steiner, not by me. The Karma of Untruthfulness. As David said before, never probably in history has more lying gone on than in our 20th century. Deliberate lying. And this was necessary in order to control people in an age where the mass media had become a necessity, the age of mass democracy, mass literacy, and so on. The masses were dangerous and could no longer be controlled only by force. You had to get inside their minds. Steiner's lectures, his purpose in these lectures was to give an understanding of major spiritual streams behind current events, to show how these streams work in different places and through brotherhoods, groups, and individuals, and to discern characteristic elements crucial to understand physical plane events. Other themes he deals with are the importance of thinking. What is our mindset? How do we approach? Do we approach with a hateful mindset, for example? Do we hate Margaret Thatcher, or do we seek to understand her? Do we understand the esoteric principles which are at work? Earlier on, Brian Gerrish said that we have to understand how the enemy works, understand the tactics and strategies, understand the secret knowledge that the enemy has, and the secret intelligence and the templates according to which they work. Method and methodology. Who are the significant individuals on both sides? Our significant allies. And the significant individuals on the other side, so to speak. What role do the press and literature play? What role do elite brotherhoods, Masons, and others play? Awareness of how dialectic and inversion, this is well before David Icke, folks. What role do dialectic and inversion play in these machinations? All this Steiner was giving lectures on in the Christmas, winter of 1916 to 1917. I'm going to skip over these next points. He then said that he knew of the existence of certain maps which had been circulating in esoteric brotherhoods in the 1880s. This is one of them. Again, I'm just going to skip over these just to show you that some of these things existed. I hope they're fairly clear. Are they fairly clear at the back? Yeah? This is another one which I myself looked into. It came out in the English magazine Truth in 1890. It was a kind of private eye of its time. And the top there, that little map at the top, presented in a sort of humorous way, this is called the Kaiser's Dream. Kaiser Wilhelm had only just come to power 2 years before. But already they were speculating how this Kaiser was going to be the cause of the First World War. There's a close-up of that map at the top. And you see, oh, I'm sorry, there's a cutoff there, but actually what it says there is Russian desert. And there was a long poem associated with this map, and that poem described how hypnotism would be used to entrap the Kaiser and his government, to lead them into this war situation. The result of this war situation would be that most European states would become republics, except England, which would retain the monarchy, but Russia would become a desert. So this is 1890, already before those lectures I mentioned to you of C.G. Harrison. You notice the Freemasonic hat here, yeah? The French Revolutionary cap, which goes right back to the ancient Persians. And my analysis of this map and the various other things which I'll show you now then brought me to write this book, Mapping the Millennium. And by the way, folks, it was published by Temple Lodge. That has nothing to do with Freemasons, just in case you're wondering. Lodge in this case simply means like lodges in gatehouse. So these are some of the gentlemen who at that time were behind these machinations, probably some of them known to you: Lord Rothschild, J.P. Morgan, the banker, Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jacob Schiff, Paul Warburg, Andrew Carnegie, and Lord Astor, Jacob Astor, and their modern counterparts, as we saw before. I'd just like to now refer you to 3 individuals coming up a bit closer to our time gradually, because this is truly an ongoing occult process of continuation of working through brotherhoods. H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells was a member of a group. Brian also mentioned this, the Fabians. The Fabians were the Webbs, Sidney Webb and Beatrice Webb, and he described how they operated. And one of the things they did was they sought to set up the first English think tank. It was a polite dining society. It went on for 7 years, 1902 to 1909, called the Coefficients. And they were very concerned that the British Empire was no longer efficient. And they were concerned, Professor Bardosh said yesterday, about the decline in health of the work of the ordinary people, yeah? Because of the disasters caused by slum dwelling and so on. And they were concerned that there would not be fit soldiers to fight for the empire. This is the Webbs, ostensibly socialist. So they got together, they invited various representatives of the imperialist elite, and for 7 years they had all kinds of ideas about how the empire could be made more efficient. And H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, who were both members of this group in the beginning, interestingly enough, these 2 guys, in their autobiographies, later referred how their foreign secretary, Sir Edward Grey, who was foreign secretary of the First World War, broke out, was already then, in 1902, calling for war against Germany. Now, in our First World War history books today, all you'll hear from Sir Edward Grey was how he hates war and how he longs for peace and how the lamps are going out in my lifetime, going out now, we shall never see them lit again in our lifetime, this famous quote. But not that he was already talking about the need and necessity for war against Germany in 1902, attested to by H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell, his colleagues in the Coefficients group. So Wells said, in anticipations of the reaction of mechanical and scientific progress upon human life and thought, the ethical system which will dominate the world state will be shaped primarily to favor beautiful and strong bodies, clear and powerful minds, and to check the procreation of base and servile types. And the alternative in right conduct between living faithfully, beautifully, and efficiently will be to die. The men of the new republic, one world government, will have little pity and less benevolence. They will hold that a certain proportion of the population exists only on sufferance and on the understanding that they do not propagate, and I do not foresee any reason to suppose that they will not hesitate to kill when that sufferance is abused. The men of the new republic will not be squeamish either in facing or inflicting death. They will have an ideal that will make killing worth the while. They will have the faith to kill. If deterrent punishments are used at all in the code of the future, the deterrent will be good, scientifically caused pain. Bertrand Russell, 1953. The same group, remember, earlier on in the century. I do not pretend that birth control is the only way in which population can be kept from increasing. War has hitherto been disappointing in this respect, but perhaps bacteriological war may prove more effective. If a Black Death could be spread throughout the world once in every generation, survivors could procreate freely without making the world too full. The state of affairs might be somewhat unpleasant, but what of that? Really high-minded people are indifferent to happiness, especially other people's. There are 3 ways, he says, continuing, of securing a society that shall be stable as regards population. Please notice these 3 ways. The first is birth control. The second is that of infanticide or really destructive wars. And the third is that of general misery, except for a powerful minority. These considerations prove that a scientific world society cannot be stable unless there is a world government. Unless one power or group of powers emerges victorious and proceeds to establish a single government of the world with a monopoly of armed force, it is clear that the level of civilization must continually decline. This is the man who the left wing in this country used to laud as a paragon of the anti-bomb movement and a great thinker. But look at that. Birth control, really destructive wars, killing, and general misery, economic breakdown, for example. So birth control, when the human being comes into this physical world, out of the spiritual world, how to stop that. And then killing, once the human being is in the world, and then creating a world which is so miserable that not only will people die as a result of those economic circumstances and other things which go on in those circumstances, but that human beings would, and here we come to a certain occult aspect, I'll go into this again later, that human beings will not wish to return to this earth. It's a threefold aspect of thought here. Diet, injections, and injunctions will combine from a very early age to produce the sort of character and the sort of beliefs that the authorities consider desirable, and any serious criticism of the powers that be will be psychologically impossible. Even if all are miserable, all will believe themselves to be happy, because the government will tell them that it is so. Diet, food, injections, and injunctions, commands from the political state. So again, we have a certain threefold operation there, getting at the human being in 3 different ways. Medicine, food, and political commands. Beliefs, what goes into your mind. Now the point is, ladies and gentlemen, that this is not Pol Pot. This is not, as Brian was saying, this is not Hitler, this is not Stalin. These are 3 of the representatives, supposedly, of the greatest minds in the Anglo-Saxon world in the 20th century. Another one, the last one, bring to your attention, 1948, Julian Huxley, British scientist, first head of UNESCO, the friendly children's organization in United Nations. UNESCO, its purpose and its philosophy. Even though any radical eugenic policy will be for many years politically and psychologically impossible, it will be important for UNESCO to see that the eugenic problem is handled with the greatest care and that the public mind is informed of the issues at stake, so that much that is now unthinkable may at least become thinkable. So, these are Anglo-Saxon ideas, and they reach back to world government thoughts which are based on a fusing of England and America, Britain and America, which reaches back to the period in the late 19th century when the British elite realized that they could not hope to divide and conquer the USA, which they had tried in the Civil War, the American Civil War. After that, they saw they couldn't do it. So what did they do? They tried they brought about, in fact, what they did with the Dutch in the 17th century. If you can't beat them, join them. So they began to merge the British and the American elite. And all sorts of things like this began to emerge from the British media at that time. Lord Rosebery, one of the British prime ministers in the 1890s, fascinating speech, Glasgow University, 1900. He's imagining what will happen when Britain and America come back together again. And at last, when the Americans became the majority, the seat of empire would perhaps have been moved solemnly across the Atlantic, and Britain have become the historical shrine and European outpost of the world empire. It would have been the most sublime transference of power known to mankind. Our conceptions can scarcely picture the procession across the Atlantic, the greatest sovereign and the greatest fleet in the universe. Ministers, government, parliament, departing solemnly for the other hemisphere under the vigorous embrace of the new world. These are the leaders of our political state imagining Britain and America fusing already in 1900. Famous journalist and occultist W.T. Stead, Pall Mall Gazette, Review of Reviews, close friend of Cecil Rhodes. Constant intercourse, as he saw it, with the spiritual world, until his death on the Titanic in 1912. He wrote a famous book in 1902 called The Americanization of the World, with these same kind of thoughts in it, where he was basically saying, we need to merge with the USA. And one other symptom from this time, which I'll just leave you with before I move on, in 1909, shortly after Theodore Roosevelt ceased being President of the United States, Arthur Balfour, who was Prime Minister of Britain for 4 short but important years at the beginning of this century, wrote Roosevelt a fascinating letter. And this gives you an idea how the British elite sought to get into the minds of the American elite at that time to suborn them and infiltrate them. Just a few things from that letter, from Balfour to Roosevelt. Universal peace will come only when these powers, the great powers of the world, have divided the world between them, or if one nation becomes overwhelmingly superior to the rest. People who can look forward and grasp the essential factors which will govern the future grouping of the nations may be able to exert a profound influence on the political future of the world. This again from the book Balfour by Kenneth Young. You probably got it in your local public library. In a loose federation, neither Britain or America will sacrifice its own individuality. There will simply be imposed on English, American, Canadian, South African, and Australian national sentiment a common Anglo-Saxon patriotism. If England and America do not federate, the history of the world will continue to be one of warfare, for a number of powers will be competing for the supremacy. If they unite against the rest of the world, they will be beyond attack. Such a federation would be a sea empire with no land borders to defend. It would possess the thinly populated areas and all the seas. The Federal Council would only deal with the question of preference and defense. No permanent government would be required. Such a confederation would be practically unassailable and would dominate the world. It would practically dictate peace by sea to the rest of the world. The balance of power would be permanently upset. And if we today look at the way in which Britain has consistently and constantly deferred in foreign policy to the US, since particularly Suez, but basically since World War II, then one can see this agenda, which stretches right back to the time of Cecil Rhodes and Balfour. I'm going to skip that. It is a long-running project. And we British have a responsibility to wake up to this biography and not be continually pointing the finger, there's the evil over there, in the 1930s with Stalin or Hitler or the Japanese or with Mao or these other characters. Of course they were terrible, but we have to be aware of how what our responsibility has been within this 20th century, or the last 20th century. The biographer Young said it was a bold and visionary scheme of Balfour's, but it was not merely an idealistic scheme. It was, in fact, a development of Pax Romana in which peace was to be legated to the rest of the world, a world government enforced not by tramping legions, but by sea. SPQR. And H.G. Wells argued that the British Empire had to be the precursor of a world state or nothing. So these were the two gentlemen who were primarily the practical hands-on guys who were tasked, as it were, with pressing this forward. Cecil Rhodes, who set up his secret society in the 1890s, this is probably familiar to some of you, particularly if you've read the works of Carroll Quigley, the Anglo-American Establishment. Sorry, I don't have a picture of that, but I do strongly recommend, if you haven't read it, the Anglo-American Establishment, 1949, Carroll Quigley. Tremendous detail, and he goes right into the details of what really is important. Individuals. Networks of individuals. Who knew who, when, how, why. And when Cecil Rhodes died, the baton was passed on to Sir Alfred Milner, who then became a member of the War Cabinet, which took over the British government in a kind of coup d'etat in 1916 and made sure Britain went on fighting the First World War when the Germans offered peace terms at Christmas 1916. That was when Steiner was giving those lectures. It was a crucial moment. There was a real chance for peace there. But this new war cabinet in Britain was determined to go on with the war, and so it did. I'll pass Quigley. And because, as I say, some of you are probably familiar with the Rhodes-Milner group, this is just some information about that. He traces how then, after the war, the origins of the Council on Foreign Relations, you're probably familiar with that, the Royal Society of International Affairs, and so on. How that went on, these organizations carried on the Anglo-American game through the 1920s and 30s. So my question was, these maps that Steiner was referring to, could you see any evidence of them in our time? And I found them in The Economist. The Economist, I believe, is really the journal to watch, because these people are the people who really understand this hidden agenda best, in my view. Bilderberg, there are, of course, guests from various media outlets that go to Bilderberg, but as far as I know, and Tony, please correct me if you know otherwise, The Economist is the only media organ which actually has so-called rapporteur at Bilderberg meetings. Reporters. Don't know why they use the fancy French word, but they do. And of course, they don't rapport with their readers. They don't tell their readers about what goes on at these meetings, but presumably they rapport with the people who are there, and also to make sure that they themselves know what the score is. So this is from the 1st of September 1990. That was the time of the Gulf War coming along, being prepared. And you see that rather innocuous thing up there on the top right, a new flag, Survey of Defense of the Democracies. And you turn to that page, and it turns out to be a 16-page special feature. Look at the flag there. That's the new flag. The flag of the European Union inside the flag of the United States, or shall we say the flag of the Anglo-Saxon world powers. And in that article, there was again a map which described the coming cultural and religious and spiritual world order. This is in tune with a deeply occult aspect, which I'll describe in a few minutes. But it was an understanding of how world history was moving on from the 20th century scenario of struggle and conflict around politics and economics into one which is based on the spirit, on ideas, on cultural values, on ideology, on religion. Yeah? And here you see the world divided according to culture. You see, for example, how 1990, Germany had just come back together, or was just about to the following month. Europe was the end of the Cold War, and already they're dividing Europe again. You see the chasm as Europe is connected with America, Euro-America, Euro-Asia. And here in Latin, it says, Haec tabula mundi vic seria est. This map is hardly serious. But if it was hardly serious, they wouldn't have written a 16-page article explaining it. So this is very, very serious stuff in this article. I'm very sorry I don't have time to go into it in great detail, but that was in my book, analyzed in detail, The Mapping of the Millennium. And then a few years later, you then get Samuel Huntington, who is good personal friends with the editors of the Economist. Samuel Huntington then brought out his famous Clash of Civilizations thesis, yeah? Which is based on the same idea, which leads then on to the events of 2001, when the Twin Towers went down in New York at the same time as the Triple Towers were going up in London, Canary Wharf. They're still at it, these map makers, the visions of the future. This is from 2006, the US Armed Forces Journal. This is how they imagine the future of the Middle East will be, and the Near East will be, after the Anglo-Americans have finished with it. And I would just draw your attention to Free Baluchistan, their plans for Pakistan. And that, of course, as I think has been mentioned already, has to do with the pipeline which is intended to come down from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan and out into the Indian Ocean, but not through present Pakistan, but through Free Baluchistan. And we can expect to hear something of the Free Baluchistan movement fairly soon. It's also based in London. And Pakistan, as you see, is shriveled. So this is one of the aims for which what they intend to do with Pakistan, which is now actually going on. So instead of a pipeline going from Iran through Pakistan into India and then China, the Anglo-Americans wish to bring one down from north to south. And in doing that, you'll notice also, it's now being flagged up in Foreign Affairs of the CFR, that the Indian Ocean is now becoming extremely important. Hence the struggles of the piracy issue off the Horn of Africa, NATO being invited to get involved in that, because the Americans are desperately concerned that the Chinese are muscling into the Indian Ocean. And particularly, notice that town, that city on the coast there, Gwadar. This will become very important, I think, in the coming months and years. Because this is where these pipelines are anticipated to come out. The Chinese have already done building there. And the Americans are very concerned that the Chinese will then, their naval forces will be actually moving into the Indian Ocean in force. So they're already setting up various places alongside. The Americans and their allies and the Brits are already figuring out how to divide Pakistan along ethnic lines, the old imperial Roman idea of divide and conquer. Now, how did, for example, did Steiner see this, these Anglo-American brotherhoods? What is the aim of these brotherhoods, these Anglo-American secret brotherhoods? He said in those lectures in 1916, The Karma of Untruthfulness, they do not work out of any particular British patriotism, but out of the desire to bring the whole world under the yoke of pure materialism. And because certain elements of the British people, I emphasize certain elements, not the whole British people, certain elements, and you can ask yourselves who? Because certain elements of the British people as the bearer of the consciousness soul, I'll come to that in a moment, but it's something very modern. Because certain elements of the British people as the bearer of the consciousness soul are most suitable for this, the brotherhoods want, by way of grey magic, to use these elements as promoters of this materialism, and this is the important point. Those who know what impulses are at work in world events can also steer them, and no other national element, no other people has ever before been so usable as material for transforming the whole world into a materialistic realm. Therefore, those who know want to set their foot on the neck of this national element within the British people and strip it of all spiritual endeavor, which of course lives equally in all human beings. Just because karma, destiny, has ordained that the consciousness soul should work here in Britain, particularly strongly, the secret brotherhoods have sought out elements in the British national character. Their aim is to send a wave of materialism over the earth and make the physical plane the only valid one. A spiritual world is to be recognized only in terms of what the physical plane has to offer. Now, I'm moving on now into some more esoteric areas, because we've heard a lot in this conference so far about energy, frequencies, vibrations, certain UFOs and aliens possibly on the outskirts have been touched upon. But from a spiritual scientific point of view, and Rudolf Steiner, for example, emphasized this again and again, what is really at work in the entire universe is beings, ladies and gentlemen. The deeds and the actions of beings. That means consciousnesses. Consciousnesses. Not abstract forces. Abstract forces are simply a further, albeit more slightly elevated and slightly spiritualized form of a materialistic natural science. They are not truly spiritual. Consciousness is truly spiritual. And there we come up against the real nub, which natural science now is telling us, is trying so desperately to understand what is consciousness. As I look at you and you look at me, are you looking simply at electrons moving around? Are you looking simply at synapses firing? Are you looking simply at electricity? Is that what you're looking at when you look at another human being? This is a subtle form of materialism, because the last 300 to 400 years, materialism has grown so strong in our Western European culture that we don't realize how profound and how deep-rooted it has become. And I'd just like to mention at this point two things, which we are not taught in our schools. One is something that Steiner, for example, emphasized very greatly, the 9th century, the year 869. 869. The Council of Constantinople, the 8th Ecumenical Council of Constantinople. And in that council, the church, who are after all the scientists of their time, the knowing ones, the cardinals, as it were, of knowledge, the gatekeepers of knowledge, they decreed that a certain doctrine would be anathematized, would be ruled out of order for all Christian believers. And that was the doctrine of what was called then, in the 9th century, the twin souls. It was taught by the Patriarch of Constantinople, Photius. Now, forgive me if this seems a little bit abstruse, but you'll see that it isn't. This doctrine of twin souls was the last, the very last little desiccated remnant, as it were, of our individual spirit. One soul is that soul which relates to our physical organism and our normal feelings of happiness and sadness, or I feel hungry, I feel happy. The other soul, it was given the name soul, but what was actually meant by it was that through which you establish your own personal connection to the divine. That through which you can be free of the gatekeepers of any religious authoritarian tradition. And in the council, the 8th council, this teaching was anathematized and ruled out of order for Western human beings. This was done for profound reasons. But I'd just like to point that up, yeah? And if you just go back a couple of hundred years before, at the 5th council of the church, which was organized by the Emperor Justinian, who wanted one people, one emperor, and one state, and one religion, one confession. And that council, the teachings of Origen, early Christian teacher Origen, were ruled out of order and anathematized. And that was the end of the teaching of reincarnation in the West. Reincarnation was known to the Celts, who were many parts of Europe. But in that council, from that time onwards, 6th century, reincarnation was ruled out and gradually disappeared from Western consciousness while continuing on in the East. And then in the 9th century, this last remnant of the individual human spirit was ruled out. You no longer have a spirit of your own. You only have a body and a soul. So you are reduced from a trichotomy, a threefold human being, of spirit, soul, and body, to a dichotomy. You are body and soul only. Think of how many adverts you've seen or magazines you've seen still today which speak only of body and soul. This is a deep-rooted concept. And despite the Protestant Reformation, the Protestants just took that on board. The only people who came close to freeing themselves in the early Reformation times were the Quakers, who began to get a sense again of their own sense of a personal relationship to the spiritual world. So the church did this back then. And this is one of the reasons for the tremendous split which then occurred. 8, 6, 9. Just as a matter of interest, because I do happen to be interested in numbers, add up to 23. The consequence of 8, 6, 9 was then the great schism of the church in 1054, when the Pope and the Patriarch excommunicated each other, the Orthodox and the Catholics. And they're still not properly talking today. They're still trying to make up, but they haven't yet fully succeeded. So that took place in the year 869. And then was 1054. And if you add those numbers up, you'll come to 1923. And that will, in 1923, for example, Rudolf Steiner attempted to bring forward new thinking on the threefold picture of man, which he developed during the First World War. So it was an attempt to bring back into European consciousness the fact that we are not only material bodies, and we not only have souls and feeling lives, which animals also have, but we are also spiritual beings. We, in fact, are, in our deepest humanity, spiritual beings having material experiences. So, consciousnesses. History is not abstractions, the movement of abstractions through history. Class war, for example, dialectical materialism. It is the deeds and actions of spiritual beings, and that includes us, because we're also spiritual beings. As we move on in our reincarnating impulses, with our reincarnating impulses in history. So when we think back to the Romans, we were there. Or when we think back to the Aztecs or the ancient Egyptians or however far you want to go, that was us. And when you think about David Rockefeller, when you think about these shepherds who are seeking to guide, these would-be shepherds who are seeking to guide who they clearly see as the sheeple, whether they're trying to pen us into concentration camps or kill us off for whatever reasons they have, one has to ask oneself, who were these people? What impulses do they actually carry? And I'd like to now to move forward. Len Horowitz spoke about nine levels of dimensions. In the esoteric tradition in the West, since again, approximately the 9th century, Dionysius the Areopagite, there was teaching of 9 celestial dimensions of consciousness, from the angels who are associated with each individual human being, to the archangels who guide groups of human beings, to the archai who guide the entire human race for certain periods of time, and then the next group of 3 who guide the natural world and provide the forces and archetypes of the natural world as distinct from purely human consciousness, and then the seraphim, cherubim, and thrones who are responsible for the archetypes of all of that. These are consciousnesses so far above us, our own, that we can hardly conceive of. But it's only our materialistic arrogance of the last 300 years which makes so many of us think that there are no consciousnesses above us other than perhaps aliens. And of course, aliens too are rejected by so many of our natural scientists. Now, if we're to understand where we are in our story, we've got to understand a couple of things, and I'm going to have to rush a little bit with this because I've got to come to my final and main point. And what is the famous question of, when is the age of Aquarius? What age are we in now? And I would submit to you, and obviously this is only a hypothesis for you, I realize that. For me, I'm pretty much convinced of it. But for you, it's only a hypothesis. You have to go away if you're interested and check it out yourself. That the age where we can try and understand where we are when we see that in the sidereal zodiac, not the tropical zodiac, which most astrologers use, but the sidereal zodiac, which looks at what is actually going on in the sky, where the planets and the constellations actually are, that from ancient times, two stars in particular are important, Aldebaran in Taurus and Antares in Scorpio. These two stars were the grand axis, and from the Babylonian times, they were located in the midpoint of the constellations Taurus and Antares. And if they're in the midpoint, the Babylonians divided the constellation in 12 groups, equal signs. I know there are unequal signs, but they divide into equal signs, and there are various reasons for that. I can't go into it now, I'm afraid. But if one sees that, then one can then figure out where are we in terms of the precession of the equinoxes. And we see that in terms of the precession of the equinoxes, we are still way well within the age of Pisces. The astronomical age of Pisces only began in the third century and finishes in something like 2375. So why did I say that the age of Pisces then begins in 1413? Well, it has to do with Venus. Because there is a phenomenon, you probably know about it, every 8 years, there are 5 conjunctions of Venus with the Sun. And this remarkable procession, beautifully harmonious form of these sequence of meetings, conjunctions, rotates throughout the whole zodiac in 1,200 years, 1199 to be exact. And this is a kind of transformer, one could think of it to be a crass image, where a high impulse from the highest hierarchical zodiacal level, a new cosmic impulse is stepped down and enters into earthly history, so that the age of Pisces for our earthly history and our culture actually begins in the 15th century, 1413, and is not due to finish until 3573, the 4th millennium. I've only now been told I've only got a short time to go, so I must, press on to various other things. But in this, to summarize on this question of the age of Pisces, this age of Pisces is that age in which we develop the consciousness soul. We have 3 bodies, 3 souls, and 3 spirits. It seems a bit bald to just state it like that, I know, but if you're interested, one can check it up in various esoteric studies, including in Steiner. But the point is that in each of those zodiacal periods of 2,160 years in our historical consciousness development, one of these new phases has been developed. In the previous age, the age of Aries, we were developing the intellectual mind soul, how to think, logic, philosophy, rationalism. Before that, we were developing our understanding of beauty, our feeling life. And now we're developing our true will life in the consciousness soul, where we ally our thought life to morality. How can I not just think, but think the good? How can I do the good through my thinking and put my thinking in the service of that which is good? So this is what the consciousness soul is really about. But the consciousness soul enters into a different relationship of earthly existence. So for example, in the sentient soul period, humanity was particularly responding to the world of the animals. I'm having to make this very brief, forgive me. Into the intellectual mind soul period, very much at the realm of the plant world. But now, our understanding is descending, since the 15th century, into the mineral world. And it is above all natural science, which has been developing since the 17th century, which is seeking to exploit and develop our understanding of the mineral world. Just pass through Terminal 5 in Heathrow and look at the architecture, you'll see what I mean. But some of the other goals of this age of Pisces, the counterforces aims, those who wish to prevent our moving on in our development of consciousness. These are the forces that I've mentioned earlier on, these occult forces. They wish to spread supermaterialism to make sure that we do not perceive of ourselves as spiritual beings, to make of the human world one machine entity. There was one one of the Star Wars movies, I seem to remember, you saw the picture of one of the planets which was entirely urban. It was just a city planet. There was nothing green there at all. That human beings will become machine animals. And the goal is to make this fifth post-Atlantean era, or fifth consciousness soul, Piscean age era, permanent. Just freeze things here. Because this is the age of decision. This is the age of freedom. If we mess up in this age, this 2,160-year period, we don't go any further. And personally, I do not feel these are the end times. As I'll say in just a minute before I finish, I feel we are only 21. We're not at the end of our life. 21 is an important point. But if we screw up now, at this age of 21, this is the decisive freedom moment. And these forces, spiritual counter-forces, working through their elite human instruments, are determined to push us off course. And they wish to further all to suppress any Latin elements from the past, from the fourth epoch, Romans, Italians, French, Spanish, Catholic Church. Any of that is to be suppressed and pushed out. Da Vinci Code. What is that about? The struggle between the Anglo-Saxon element and the Catholic element. And they wish to block the Russian element and destroy the Slavic element of the future. They wish to ignore, nothing is to come anymore from the German-speaking world or the Central European world. But to overcome this in our fifth epoch, we need to see that individuals are actually autonomous spiritual beings. We need to recover a spiritual science to complement our natural science and overcome the inheritance of Kant, who put limits on human knowledge. We need to develop human imagination, visions of society based on the human being, not visions which are based on natural models out there, animal models or jungle models or abstract intellectual models, but we have to ask ourselves, what is the inner nature of the human being? My thinking, my feeling, my willing. And what corresponds in society to those three elements within the human being? So many of our social problems are caused by confusion between the realms of religion, spiritual life, political life, and economic life. Interference in between these lives. These realms, they need to be separated, clearly demarcated, so that they can operate in a clearly distinct, functional, but interrelated way, in the same way that our nervous system, our rhythmic system, and our metabolic system all operate within our human organism. And Europe is the big problem for Britain. Europe needs to find a new form for itself, which is not obviously what the EU is trying to bring about, which is not an Anglo-American plot, so to speak, or a Vatican plot. But what's coming about in the future is a tremendous clash in this century, this decisive century between the Americans and the Chinese, these two Atlantean powers, if you will, old Atlantean powers. And Europe and Africa are going to be caught in between this. So how can Europe find a new form for itself so that it can be a bridge towards these two, the we-ness and the me-ness of America and East Asian culture? And the last thought I'll leave you with is that this century, therefore, because there's so much I've not been able to say, but this century is so crucial, I would just strongly recommend you to look at the history of the 7th century and the 14th century, 7 and 14, and compare it to the 21st century. And think, what three things does the human being do in the first 3 years of his or her life? Walking, speaking, thinking, by the age of 3. That is a profound archetype. And if we can meditate and really think into what that archetype means, and then see how as we grow up, all of us have been through this, that we then see how we develop as children before a change of our teeth, our will life, and separate ourselves from the physical body of our mothers to develop our own forces, physical forces. And then how before 14 with our puberty, which is the puberty marker, we develop our own rhythmic system and we develop our feeling life, where art is so important for the child. And then in 14 to 21, we develop our own thinking life and learn to think for ourselves and not due to authorities. Then if we can see that this is a profound threefold archetype, that we will see how the 7th century and the 14th century, something happened in history. And I'm not only talking Western history. I'm talking about right across the world, that certain events happened which are analogous to what happens in the individual life of the individual human being in the 7th century and the 14th century. Only a hypothesis. Please think about it and check it out for yourself. And then I think you will see that now we're in this 21st century where we have what happens at 21 traditionally. In Japan it's 20, but that's still the 21st year. The key to the door. We become responsible. The time of freedom truly begins. We enter into our own house, which we've spent 21 years building, and we have to make it a real home. But precisely at that moment comes the real crunch on the quest from the counterforces side. And there I'm absolutely with Brian Gerrish. We need to be absolutely aware of the strategies and the tactics and realize that these counterforces, without whom, by the way, we must never forget, we will never have our freedom. Our freedom depends, in this modern consciousness soul age, of growing to freedom through resistance. Just like in any sport. You cannot develop yourself without your opponent. So no grounds for hatred, no matter what these evil characters seem to get up to. Without them, there is no freedom. So with that difficult thought, I will leave you. I apologize for being a bit rushed and hasty, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you for your attention.